What I have here is the brand new largest engine that XICOY has made to date. This is a very nice piece of kit, the XICOY X240 engine, and we happen to have two of them in stock here for one of our aircraft. So what better time to check it out than now? Let's dive into this thing. Now, generally, I wouldn't do a comparison video, but we happen to have a XICOY 240 here in the shop at the same time, and we are going to take a look at both of these engines. Obviously, because we have two 240 engines, it just makes sense to compare them. Now, I'm a XICOY dealer, but I also use a XICOY engine in one of my planes, and many of our aircraft get XICOY engines as well. Both great engines. I'm excited to see what this little engine can do, but I'm also interested in seeing the comparison between these two because it is an interesting comparison. Ultimately, make your choice on what you think is a better model, but I've been using the 240 for a long time, and it is a wonderful engine. I'm sure this engine from XICOY will also be a great engine. All right, so initially the first thing that I can see when I take a look at these engines, the XICOY, of course, is a little bit longer engine, and I think what that really has to come down to is the tail cone. If you take a look at the tail cone of the XICOY compared to the XICOY, obviously the XICOY has, this is hard to do, a little bit shorter tail cone than the XICOY engine. So that's pretty much what makes up the size difference between these two. But if you look at the girth or diameter of the engine, the XICOY is actually a little bit smaller engine. So on the XICOY, I think we've got 118 millimeters, and the XICOY engine, we are looking at about 113 millimeters, I believe. So about 5 millimeters smaller on the XICOY engine. It is noticeable enough that when you look at it, you can actually see the difference. Okay, so first thing we'll do here in comparison is the weight. So we've got our 240 engine. The accessory components are very similar, so we're not going to worry about that. I just want to see what the difference in the core of the engine is. So 1843 for the XICOY 240. And we have 1939, so 100 grams difference between those two engines. So the XICOY is about a quarter pound heavier. So here's an overhead shot of our engines. Both those engines have the starters lined up together, and you can see there the body of the XICOY is just a little bit longer than the body of the XICOY. That's partly because the starter is a little bit longer, but the engine is slightly longer than the XICOY engine. But you can visibly see the difference in the diameter there, or you should be able to in the picture. All right, so I'm just going to give you guys my observations here as I look at these two engines. Both amazing quality engines. We've got aluminum pieces everywhere, nice brushless starter motors and everything. Just great quality engines either way. Interesting comparisons. If you look at the XICOY on this side, obviously the XICOY on this side, the turbine wheel or compressor itself is so much further back on the XICOY engine. Like you're about an inch back there probably between the two. And if you look at the diameter of the XICOY engine, it is substantially larger than the XICOY engine. Now I'm just going to give you some rough numbers here just to compare. So the intake of the XICOY is about 66 millimeters, and then the intake of the XICOY is going to be about 55 millimeters. So substantially different there, about half an inch difference between the two. So probably in my mind, the biggest difference between these two engines, obviously we haven't run the XICOY yet, and I've heard it runs amazing, but this engine has just come out, and anyways, the biggest difference between them is if one of my customers was to order a XICOY 240 right now, and I don't have one in stock, we are going to get this engine here in the shop in about 7 to 10 days. And if you order a XICOY 240 right now, as of today's date, you're probably going to be waiting a couple months. Obviously that varies, but XICOY is a lot easier to get engines from, so that does make a big difference in my mind, but your results may vary. So let's get this thing put on the test stand and do some test runs with this. I'm really excited to get this engine on the test stand. We're going to do our standard setup. We're going to set up with the restart. We're going to do our normal process. We're also going to put a liter of fuel in our test fuel cell, and we're going to run a liter and see how fuel efficient this engine is. Now, everybody seems to miss this point in my videos. I am at 3,300 feet above sea level in my current location. We always see a reduced power output on any engine. It doesn't matter what engine it is. Because of our elevation, we see a 10, 15, 20% reduction in thrust. So when we don't get 240 newtons out of this engine, don't be surprised, please. All right, so here's some interesting information on the XICOY unit here. So we can see our ambient temperature, we've got our pressure, altitude, 1117 meters. So we are at 3,300 feet. And we can see our power there. We're gonna get 85% of what this engine should produce. So we're getting a 15% reduction in our engine because of our altitude. Okay, so we're just going through our tests here. So what I do when I get a new engine, whether it's a Swiwin or a XICOY, I always run the fuel pumps for 10 minutes. So what I'll do here is we're gonna go prime pump, turn that on, and all I'm doing is running this pump in a closed loop, so it's sucking from our fuel tank, coming out, back through the vent line. So we're just gonna let this run for 10 minutes, and the reason I do that is it helps to break in the fuel pumps. All right, so we've burned in our fuel pump, just going through the other running settings here. So full power, 240 newtons, 54.5 pounds of thrust. Interesting that we're at 113,000 RPM. So that is a big difference. Generally with a lot of engine manufacturers right now, especially XICOY, is you tend to see a higher RPM setting. This engine isn't like that. So I suspect we'll see some higher ratings on this engine in the near future. And our idle is 29,000 RPM. That is really low, so that's pretty cool. I like to see that. So we've also got acceleration delay 30, so we've got a manual number there. That's new. Ambient accel auto, ambient decel auto, that's typical. So all right guys, so we got the setup here. We've got our 1 liter fuel cell full of fuel. I've got my radio sitting here so you're able to see my throttle stick as I operate it, and the only thing I have to do here is get the air out of our line there. So I'm just going to pop this off the turbine, because right now there's a bunch of air inside the line feeding the fuel cell. Okay, so we got our scale in pounds right now. We'll just keep it there, and we're ready to run the engine. Now don't worry, I know I forgot to start the starter, but we pull the numbers later on from the actual video footage to get our accurate data. All right, so just some initial thoughts on the test run with this engine. Performed very well. Obviously, the full throttle fuel consumption, I messed up a little bit because I didn't start the timer in time. So I'll use the time from the video itself to determine the fuel consumption for the 1 minute at full throttle. Restart, it restarts very quick. Probably because this is a dual igniter setup on the 240, which is also something that this engine has that the Swewin engine does not have. When you get into the 300 size Swewin engines, they have the dual igniters, but the 240 does not. So very good engine. Let's pull it off the test stand, get it over to the table, and take a final look at it. All right, so my final thoughts on the XICOY or XICOY 240 engine. This is going to be a really popular engine, is my guess. I think as the engine gets better and better, which seems to be the general norm with XICOY engines, and what I mean by that is the 80, as an example, is now a 95. The 120 is now a 132. So I suspect we will see this engine getting up-tuned as the future goes on, and I think there's a lot more potential in this engine than is currently being used. Now, I went back and looked at the footage, and I got the actual numbers on the 1 liter test run. So 1 liter at full throttle lasted 88 seconds, which is 1.47 minutes. What that actually means is it uses 11.36 milliliters per second. So 1 minute of running on this engine at full throttle uses 681 milliliters a minute, which I believe is under the reported value. So very fuel efficient engine. That's one thing that's going to differ greatly between the XICOY and the Swewin. I think the Swewin is closer to 800 milliliters per minute. So the Swewin is a little bit more thirsty of an engine compared to the XICOY engine, but the XICOY engine does weigh a little bit more, so there is a bit of a payoff there, but it's both great options. So do I think this is a good engine? I do. I think it's an awesome engine. As I'm a Swewin dealer, I always prefer Swewin, but I do have a BDX coming up soon for myself, and I'm still at a bit of a toss-up whether I'm putting in a XICOY 240 or a Swewin 240. We'll see what happens. So if you guys have any questions or comments about this test run or anything else, you can comment down below. You can also shoot me an email, thelightersideofrc@gmail.com. And the other plug I'm going to put in here is for my After Dark channel, The Lighter Side of RC After Dark. What that actually is a completely separate channel, and we do live streams here from the shop. We do them for about 2 hours every 2 weeks. It's tons of fun if you're on the live stream because we get to interact with each other. So if you're on the live stream watching, you can ask me questions, and usually I've got a videographer doing the videoing and asking me questions, which is awesome. So we get to communicate back and forth, and you get a real behind the scenes look of what goes on here at the shop. So encourage you guys to check it out. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.